What's good? It's Woog. I wanted to take a minute to acknowledge and pay respect to Tito Jackson, who just passed away at 70 years old. Tito Jackson is a member of the legendary Jackson 5, later the Jacksons, when they moved from Motown to Epic. But when you think about the Jackson family and their musical legacy, it's not only a complicated story because of all the stories that have come out about, Joe Jackson's treatment of the kids, but when you really take it in its totality and you also consider the success of so many members of the family, it's not only Michael Jackson. You obviously had Janet Jackson, but Jermaine Jackson also had a really good solo career. And you also have to kind of consider the times. Like, this was a family out of Gary, Indiana. Like, look at Gary, Indiana today. And this was a family, a black family coming up in the 50s and 60s in a very blue collar working class environment. And yeah, Joe Jackson was a tough disciplinarian. So it's complicated in that, yes, he did lead this family to tons of success, but there was also a lot of trauma that the kids carried on throughout their adult lives, evidently, and to varying degrees. But if you look at the Jacksons' origin story, basically, their dad, Joe Jackson, he was a steel mill worker, and their mom, Catherine Jackson, she was a Jehovah's Witness, and she was a bit of a musician. She played clarinet, piano, and she always sung and kind of hummed and sung tunes to the kids when they were really young. So that's where they get a lot of their musical ear and musical influence and taste, was through Catherine Jackson, even though it was dad who was basically leading the group when they became a group. Now, them becoming a group, it wasn't a foregone conclusion. It was actually Tito Jackson who was caught playing his dad, Joe Jackson's guitar, when Tito broke a guitar string. So Joe Jackson fixes the guitar, he has Tito play for him, and then he gets Tito his own guitar and forms a group with Tito, the older brother Jackie, and the younger brother Jermaine. And it was Jackie and Jermaine that were the singers, and Tito was playing the guitar, and that was a trio. That's where the group originated. It wasn't until Marlon and Michael came of age, and coming of age is relative, right? They were still kids, but they joined the group years later, and they changed their name from the Jackson Brothers to the Jackson 5, and they were actually on a record label before Motown. The first label they were on was actually called Steeltown, and they released a couple singles like Big Boy. This was in the late 60s, and this family was grinding. They had so many different gigs and rehearsals and performances before they even got to Motown. So once they got to Motown, that's when their epic run starts. And the beginning of this run was nothing short of phenomenal. When you really consider like the first 4 singles that they put out on Motown between 1969 and 1970, those 4 singles were I Want You Back, probably their most famous and iconic single. Like, I Want You Back is a historic song. And keep in mind, this is well into the Motown story. Like, the Motown had already had major hits from Marvin Gaye, The Temptations, obviously the Supremes, Diana Ross, Smokey Robinson, and the Miracles. So Motown, Mary Wells, Martha and the Vandellas, like, they had been going on for over a decade at this point. So the Jacksons come along in 1969, and it's I Want You Back, ABC, The Love You Save, and I'll Be There. All 4 of those singles hit #1, not only on the R&B charts, but on the US Hot 100, the pop charts, hit #1 with each of those 4 singles. That's an incredible, historic, we're talking early Elvis type of run right there. The Jackson 5 was on top. They had cartoons, commercials, all this merchandising around the Jackson 5. They were a brand and a household name by this point. Like, I remember as a little kid, like growing up in the mid 80s, I remember in our household, one of the first records I recall seeing when I was digging through my dad and mom's records was that Going Back to Indiana record from 1971. I think on the actual vinyl, or on the vinyl cover, it was the record, I think, actually belonged to my beloved late Uncle Odie. I think it was my uncle's record, but it made its way over to our house somehow. And also, one of my earliest memories of music as a kid was my dad always just going to the piano just randomly. Like, on any day, you just go up to the piano and just go and he would just play it like really well. Like he probably do the same thing right now today. In fact, next time I see him, I'm probably gonna ask him to just go up to the piano and, you know, see if he could play it as easily and as fluidly as he would play it seemingly all the time back in the day when we were all growing up. And sometimes he would perform like the whole song. So he would do the dun 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 dun. Dun, 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 and then he would go into the verses and stuff pretty well. Like, again, I'm gonna see if he'll still do it. I'm sure that he will. But yeah, Going Back to Indiana was released in 1971. It was a soundtrack album. I think like Bill Cosby was like the host, so they had like these skits in between the songs. And again, that soundtrack album was released in 1971, so that was after the first few Jackson 5 albums, like Diana Ross Presents the Jackson 5, ABC. Third album, I think, was the name of the third album. Then they had the Jackson 5 Christmas album, but they also had like a Motown compilation. So the big hits that came off of that Jackson 5 Christmas album were I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus and Santa Claus Is Coming to Town. Those are two iconic renditions of those songs. Like every year, if you're listening to the radio during the holidays, you'll often hear those two Jackson 5 songs. And I mean, Michael Jackson, young Michael was just magnificent, wasn't he? And I think they had one more album before that, Going Back to Indiana. I think that Maybe Tomorrow had already been released. And by that point, they had another couple successful singles, not #1 chart topping singles, but they had like Mama's Pearl at #2, Never Can Say Goodbye at #2, Maybe Tomorrow at #20. So they go on to have pretty good success throughout the next couple of years, 72, 73. Then they have another hit in 74 with Dancing Machine. And then a couple of albums later, the Jackson 5 leaves Motown and heads to Epic. And at this time, Jermaine Jackson stays with Motown as the brothers leave Motown, because Jermaine Jackson was married to Berry Gordy's daughter, Hazel Gordy, I believe. So he stays with Motown. The brothers leave. They start getting produced and songwritten by the legendary production and songwriting team of Gamble and Huff. So they start working with Gamble and Huff for their next couple of albums, the Jacksons and Going Places, with songs like Enjoy Yourself. A few singles later, they had Blame It on the Boogie, although Blame It on the Boogie was actually, I believe, written by Mick Jackson, and it was self-produced by the Jacksons. So at this time, the Jacksons are starting to do more self-production. And by this time, they've got a new member, a younger Jackson named Randy Jackson is in the group, because again, Jermaine's no longer in the group, although he does come back years later for Victory, which came out a little bit after Thriller. But the last three Jackson's albums before they disbanded for years, they ended up coming back years and years later for 2300 Jackson Street. That was like in '89. But they had three more albums, Destiny, Triumph, and Victory. And those three albums were really a late resurgence and were really good albums for the group. Like, they didn't have any more #1 hits, but if you take like Destiny, for instance, that had the two singles, Blame It on the Boogie and Shake Your Body Onto the Ground, or Shake Your Body Down to the Ground. So there was Destiny, there was Triumph, and I like Triumph a lot. I always like the track 1 from this album. Let me remove it from the actual sleeve so you can see it a little bit better. But this is Triumph, and track 1 is Can You Feel It? I always like that dun 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 dun, and then it just sounds grandiose with the dun 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 dun. And then in the beginning vocal, I believe it's Randy Jackson that's doing the lead for the first couple of lines. And then Michael Jackson punches in for like the bridge headed to the chorus, and it's just remarkable. You just instantly hear that special voice that Michael Jackson has and the energy that he brings into the song. Because Randy he's not a bad singer. It just sounds like a lot more vanilla in terms of his vocal texture, his timbre. And then you hear Michael punch in, and it's like, wow, okay. It just gave the song a real shot in the arm. But I like Can You Feel It? I like Lovely One, Heartbreak Hotel. Those are all on Triumph. Very good album. And this one came right after Michael Jackson dropped Off the Wall. So Michael Jackson drops Off the Wall in like '79. They release Triumph in 1980. And then a couple years later, Michael Jackson obviously releases Thriller, and then the Jacksons release Victory. And they go on tours with each of these albums. They had like a Triumph tour, they had a Victory tour. So think about this. Michael Jackson, after Thriller, was still touring with the brothers, doing his solo stuff and doing the stuff with the Jacksons. So yeah, this was a family affair, even as far or as late as 1984. So this was a really good run when you consider they had their first success with I Want You Back in 1969. 1969 and carried that success. Yes, they did have a couple rough spots in the mid to, I would say early to mid 70s. By the time you get to 74, 75, they start to wane a little bit. Like they're getting a little bit older, so they don't have the lure of being like a kid group with this 10, 11, 12-year-old Michael Jackson. They're like young adults and late teenagers by that point, so they kind of waned a little bit, but they ended up really picking it back up, especially when you couple their success later on as the Jacksons with Michael Jackson's solo success. So yeah, you really can't tell the story of the Jacksons, especially their origins, without mentioning Tito Jackson. And when you look at a lot of their footage, especially early in their career, you would always see Tito with the guitar. You see all the brothers dancing and stuff, but Tito would always have the guitar in tow. So yeah, man, rest in peace, Tito Jackson. You know, he did have 3 sons with his wife Dolores, who he was married to for like 16 years, from like 72 to 88. And years later, she was actually murdered by a music businessman. This is years later, and he, I believe, got convicted of the murder of Tito's ex-wife. Very sad, but they had 3 sons together, and those 3 sons had a 90s group called 3T. I don't have the CD with me, but I bought their CD in, I believe, 95. I have it in storage somewhere. I have like a lot of CDs in storage somewhere. But that group 3T had an album, and it was actually pretty good. Their single was called Anything, but they had another couple of good songs. They had a second single called Why, and then a song from that album called I Need You, which I always really like, because at the very end you get Michael Jackson's vocal. I think that was Michael who's like adding to the chorus towards the end of that I Need You song. But yeah, 3T had a pretty good album. And you know, Tito Jackson, he was an avid vintage car collector. He was always the brother, along with, I would say, Marlon, who seemed like they were less engulfed with the stardom that came with the Jacksons. Like when you hear the other brothers, you know, Michael, Jermaine, even Jackie to an extent, the oldest brother to a lesser extent, but then you've got the sisters, Janet, LaToya. They all seem like they were somewhat impacted by the fame, by the stardom that came to the family. Tito always seemed like the one who just had like regular hobbies and stuff. I don't know what his trauma was or how he processed it, but when I would see the Jacksons like in interviews and stuff, Tito always seemed like he was the one who was just kind of like more of a normal dude. And it's funny, I always thought that Tito resembled Joe Jackson the most. Like if you look at their facial features, and you know, the other brothers were always kind of had a skinnier build. Tito was always a little bit stockier than the other brothers. But yeah, I always thought that Tito resembled Joe and just kind of seemed like he was a little bit more of just a regular dude, a little less of a star, or acted a little bit, spoke a little bit less like a star. And he released some solo albums of his own, like in 2016 and 2021. I think the 2021 or 2022, but the first one I believe was called Tito Time. And he had some good collaborations. And you know, he had the first one was a pop-ish, R&B-ish album, and then the second one was more of a blues album, which might have been more in line with what his genuine musical tastes might have been. But he was performing solo years before that. Like he started performing solo, I believe, like at around 2003, and then years later dropped those 2 albums. And Tito, like his other brothers, really stuck up and took up for Michael when he was going through those allegations. Tito was one of those siblings who was always defending Michael and saying that those rumors were false, that the rumors were untrue about what Michael was alleged to have been doing. But yeah, rest in peace, Tito Jackson, and condolences to the Jackson family. Let me know what you feel about the Jacksons, the Jackson 5, Tito Jackson, and just the Jackson family musical legacy. I mean, you want to talk about, I mean, it's really extraordinary when you think about it. This family out of Gary, Indiana, having the level of success that they did, several siblings throughout the years. Let me know your thoughts on Tito Jackson and the Jacksons in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel if you love music like I do. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.